Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I want to talk about a certain kind of story that you will get in comics. And I would say not just in comics, but in a lot of other science fiction mediums as well. And fandoms as well. Things like Star Wars and Star Trek, and certainly within comics. And this is this idea where you have a female character who's not just a Mary Sue, but a female character who is portrayed as being almost saintly, at the very least in the eyes of the people creating the story. And attached to that, they are not only ultimately likable and ultimately good at things, which a Mary Sue usually is, but at the same time, you have a degradation of all of the male characters around them. And this is something which you don't always see in a Mary Sue character or in a Mary Sue story. But it is something that you will see if you crack open almost any science fiction product in this present day. And quite honestly, although I'm talking mainly about comics here because I have the most information on it, the thing that really got me thinking about this was Star Trek Lower Decks. Because that's what you have. You have this character who is portrayed as someone who can do no wrong, who can do anything when she puts her mind to it. Nothing will get in her way. And at the same time, all of the male characters on the show are simply viewed as ineffectual buffoons. And this kind of story expresses itself in many different ways. And some of those ways are the fact that we have no continuity. Some of it is that you have female characters who are always going on about science, and it seems like the story has to talk about science and females, but at the same time, it doesn't actually talk about science. You have all of these modern, I guess we'll call them tropes, and they enter into these stories. And a lot of people scratch their heads and go, why is this here? You're just ruining the story. You're just ruining this franchise. Why would you put these things there? Any person who actually looks at these kinds of stories and knows how to tell a good story would see that they do not fit, and therefore you should keep them out. But there is a very specific reason why these things are put into these stories, and they all tie together into what I'm going to talk about today. Because I'm going to talk about the basic rationale behind the people who believe in modern feminism. Because that's where all of these ideas come from. These quote-unquote progressives who at their heart are feminists. Now, before I even begin there, I have to state a couple of things. Yes, I truly believe that men and women are equal, but equal does not mean the same. The word equal actually means balanced. It's like a balanced equation, I always say. You have an equation where it is 2 plus 3 equals 4 plus 1. Now, this is a balanced equation because both sides equal each other. But both sides are not the same as each other, and so it is the same with men and women. Men are 2 plus 3, women are 4 plus 1. Equal, but different. Also, I have to state that when talking about things like feminism, you're kind of between a rock and a hard place trying to explain them in the way that I do. And this would include other topics that I have touched upon. Topics like the Afrocentrism, Afrofuturism video that I did not too long ago. Or the topic that I touched on with feminism and Nietzsche a while ago. And yes, that's how I say his name. That's how everybody here says his name. That's the way I'm going to say it. But the point is that with all of these ideologies, philosophies, worldviews, it is difficult to understand them because when you want to understand them, you want to understand them in a rational way. That's the best way to look at things because your rationality should be in accord with reality, and we want to look at things in accord with reality. But the thing is that all of these, again, philosophies, ideologies, mindsets, they are built at their core upon a rejection of rationality itself. So at the same time as trying to look at it rationally, you have to look at it according to the way these people understand it in a non-rational way. And I'm usually criticized by people saying I'm imposing outside standards upon these thinkers and their thought. Well, yes, I am. I'm imposing an idea of rationality upon them because they're not rational and I want to understand them in a rational way. So, all of that being said, at the very least, I want to talk about my experience with these ideas and how I see them playing out within the canvas of ideas of Western civilization. Now, I would say that feminism is something that has been around for more than 100 years. In its current beginnings. Now, the current iteration of it, what is being lived out by the feminists now, many people would simply trace it back to the 1960s, but I think it's something much older than that. At the very least, going back to the mid to late 1800s. And again, this might just be me and the way that I look at these ideas, but I would say that this feminism arose from the works of people like Simone de Beauvoir. And the people around her, the thinkers around her, they all tried to figure out a way to make Nietzsche's ideas available to the female. Because Nietzsche's ideas were basically, if you want to look at it from an outside perspective, showing that people should be able to do whatever they want whenever they want to do it. That you need to will simply for the sake of willing. That you need to accumulate power simply for the sake of accumulating power. That destruction was equal to the act of creation. All of these kinds of ideas, which if you, again, impose the standards of Western morality for the last couple of thousand years upon these ideas, it simply boils down to these are people who want to do what they want to do. They want to be selfish, and they need to eliminate all who would oppose them in order for them to have free reign to do this. And this is where I think the very origins of feminism come in. Because you have these thinkers, again, they're trying to take this idea of Nietzsche and some degree of Schopenhauer and to bring it into the female. Because those two thinkers, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, they detested women. And they didn't think that women really could follow their philosophies. And again, that's broad strokes. I'm sure someone will argue that point. But the point is that the ideas that emerged from these thinkers, and one that we can still see today and being played out today, is an idea of the erasure of the man-woman divide, which is to say that they wanted to erase all differences between men and women. Now, the way this actually plays out is a little different than it sounds, because really what this early feminist philosophy wanted to do is to make women into men. They make women into men so that they can follow the male philosophy of these male philosophers who exclusively, knowingly or unknowingly, made this philosophy for men. These women wanted to make themselves into men so that they could follow this philosophy so that they could do whatever they wanted to do. And so what they did was they rejected all of the traditional ideas of feminism and tried to make women into men, and so erase what was actually female. But at the same time, they had to attack men, and they had to bring men down a couple of pegs. Why? Because if you're trying to make women into men, first of all, an easy way to do that is to lower the bar for what an actual man is. And so women could actually reach the lower rungs of the bar of manhood. And I would say, even at that time, your late 1800s, you start to see an attack on what I usually focus on, and that is an attack on the traditional idea of a hero. Because the traditional idea of a hero certainly does, historically and in its construct, promote the absolute excellence of manhood. I would say it promotes the absolute excellence of womanhood as well, but that womanhood they wanted to erase and ignore, and at the same time get rid of this heroic kind of male. So I would say that at its base, this is why you see a lot of characters being women turned into men. Things like Carl Manvers in the comics, or She-Hulk. These characters who were traditionally beautiful women turned into something that looks like a grotesque man. But there are finer points to that, which I will get to in a few minutes. So let's skip forward all the way to the 1960s, because I would say those ideas that I just talked about kept on brewing and growing in little areas as they could over the intervening 50, 60, 70 years. Of course, they were interrupted by little inconveniences like 2 world wars, but these feminist ideas continued to spread and continued to grow until we get to the 1960s. Now, within the 1960s, again, we have a rejection of the traditional idea of womanhood. And this is where we can look at really modern ideas and apply them to what actually happened. The modern way of looking at this is the idea of the sovereign individual. That is to say, these women wanted to become sovereign individuals. And men can become sovereign individuals as well, but we're just focusing on the female here. So a sovereign individual is a person who gets to make their choices dependent on nothing else than their own choices. Now, this, of course, would harken back to that old idea of Nietzsche of willing for the sake of willing. But if you are going to have a real sovereign individual, they need to reject everything that will impact their choices. And that is to say, they need to reject the idea of human nature, and they even need to reject the idea of nature itself. They need to reject even the idea of reality itself. Because if you're saying there are fixed rules of nature and human nature and reality, and you are subject to them, then you're saying that your choices are also subject to them, and therefore you cannot be a complete sovereign individual, and therefore you cannot do whatever it is you want. But the sovereign individual seeks to liberate themselves from any constraint whatsoever. And of course, for a woman, the most constraining thing is what her body is built for to begin with, and that is to produce children. Because, of course, producing a child is going to put a whole bunch of constraints on you. Not only do you have some association with a man, and are probably, in their view, tainted by the ideas of love, but at the same time you have a devotion to a child. All of this, for the feminist, is seen as enslavement to these other obligations, and they need to be gotten rid of. Because, of course, you cannot have them, and again, be a sovereign individual. But the way that this was actually played out was a way in which they sublimated the power of the female individual to do something else. Now again, sublimation is an idea that goes straight back to Nietzsche. It's an idea that you take the power which is directed towards something specific and you redirect it to what you want it to go to. And this is what the female did in the 1960s. They took the reproductive act, which is supposed to be powered towards, geared towards producing a child and bringing up a family, and they took that power and sublimated it and redirected it towards something else. And what they directed it towards was their own use of that power to build up a protective wall against reality itself. Now, this is something that I talked about a number of times. Your quote-unquote progressives do this all the time. They are trying to defend themselves against reality itself. And the problem is that reality has a constant and unlimited amount of power. So for these people to even begin to fight against reality itself, they themselves need a supply of constant and unlimited power. This, in part, is why the progressives focus on power so much. But the way that it expresses itself within feminism is that you have these females. They're taking the reproductive act and they're redirecting its power towards controlling men. Because, of course, the men will then supply them with the resources that they need in order for them to build a bubble around them so that the impact of reality does not actually reach them. And so they can live in basically a fantasy world. And this is what we see happening in the 1960s. However, this quickly fell apart for the feminists because the power that females traditionally have, and that is based upon the reproductive act, is based upon two things that degrade very quickly, and they are youth and beauty. And I just want to break in here for a second and talk to all of us, which are probably nerds at heart, because when you were a boy, at the very least a teenager, or possibly even a little older, and you looked at the women or the girls around you, you kind of felt like you were outmatched in some kind of way, did you not? It was because, of course, their power comes from this idea of youth and beauty and that it allows them to do what their bodies naturally do. But for men, their power, which is the power to help those around him, that is to say, to supply those around him that he cares for with what they need, that power is something that begins at that point and becomes cumulatively more and more as he gets older. He becomes stronger. He becomes more educated. He becomes more experienced. He begins to collect possessions or money that he can use to actually support those around him. So again, for men, this is cumulative, and really it doesn't have a shelf life like the female power does, or the source of the female power does. And the reason why I want to discuss that is because the idea of a hero used to be able to give to boys and young men that idea that they can become something greater, that their self-worth and their heroism, their power can be developed, but it needs to be developed in an incremental way in order for them to become greater and greater. This was one of the great things about the idea of hero, that it could inspire within especially young boys and young men. But that was taken away, or at the very least the underpinnings of it, which is virtue and the idea that you need to be virtuous, were taken away at this time. And this is why I would say a lot of us probably felt a little bit confused about the fact that you have these girls, these women, they seem to be more powerful in a certain way, at the very least more together than we were at that age, and not understanding that we would get there because we get there in a different way, because we're equal but different, because we had to build up incrementally what we were. And personally, I would say that that really realization that we should have had because of the heroes that were around us was taken away from us by the constant degradation of the idea of a hero. But anyways, back to what I was talking about. So you have women, and they quickly realized that this kind of power was going to run out really quickly. Or at the very least, they, as the power makers and power holders, would be replaced fairly quickly by the younger generation. And so they moved on to taking this power that they had and use it in a way to institutionalize their own female power. And this became expressed in what was happening within law within the late 70s and early and late 80s. And this is a redirection of the law towards viewing women as the oppressed, to viewing women as the saintly figure and the men as the demonic figure in the law courts. And this was something that was specifically directed by feminist thinkers. They've already come out by this point and admitted that they used data to try to convince these lawmakers to make these changes, and this data they massaged in certain ways and left out key elements in order for them to see what they wanted them to see, in order for them to get the results of viewing women as saintly figures and men as always the oppressors, men as always the demonic. And this has been instituted within our laws for at least 30 to 40 years now. So this was wildly effective for your feminist thinkers. It was a way for them to institutionalize their power. You wonder why they're always talking about institutional power and institutional this and that. It's because that's what they do, and that's what they've done for a long time. They're only describing to you the exact thing that they are doing, which many of us should really wake up and realize. When these people talk about this, we shouldn't scratch our heads and say, why are they talking about this? This isn't real. Yes, actually it is real. It is real because that's what they've been doing for the longest time. But you certainly can see the impact of this kind of viewing of the male and the female in the stories that we see today. The idea that the female is the saintly figure and can do no wrong, even though most of us who can think critically look at the story and go, no, most of what this character is doing is wrong. I would consider it wrong, and so would most of Western civilization and its history. No, they're not good people at all. But in the eyes of their creators, they are building these stories upon the notion that the female is always the saintly and the male is always the domineering. And this is expressed within Marvel and its podcasts over and over and over again. I have listened to many of them. They talk about power all the time, but they also talk about it in the terms of empowerment. They use that term a lot. And the thing is that most of us would say, what is empowerment? That just means giving someone power, right? Well, no. According to feminists, empowerment is a female form of power, which in their definition, a female form of power would be cooperative and creative and empathetic, whereas your male form of power is inherently destructive and divisive. This idea of empowerment versus power is at the core of the way that these people speak and at the core of the way that they think. And as I said, I can attest to that by hearing this word and this idea over and over again within these Marvel podcasts. And so this is an idea that is at the core of these stories that you're viewing or reading as well. And just quickly, if you want to look at a text that has some sources to confirm what I've just been talking about, a good book would be Legalizing Misandry, which is a book that came out in 2006. And it talks about how law, public policy, education, and journalism were reshaped into a worldview of ideological feminism to point to men as a class and to demonize them as a class. Again, it comes down to class warfare. That, I'd say, would be a good starting point if you're looking for some more resources on this. But if anybody has anything more specific than that book itself, go right ahead and put that in the comments. Oh, and one other thing that I forgot to mention. One of the reasons why Marvel focuses on stories that do this and look at these women as saintly, and that being the source of their power instead of the physical, well, again, you can see this played out especially in the Marvel podcast. There's even multiple interviews that Sana Amanat did where she talks about the importance of body diversity. I think the first one that I ran across was a Fast Company video, which I did a video off of. It's an old video, but I'll link that in the description as well. She talks about body positivity as being supremely important to the stories that they have to tell. And when I heard that for the first time, and she gave no explanation whatsoever why, I just scratched my head and said, What are you talking about? Why is this important? Well, of course, the reason why it is important is that Marvel originally was very progressive in the 60s and the 70s, but it was progressive in the way that it gave women power through using the sexualization of the women. But they have to get rid of this idea now. They have to move away from this idea because they realize that's not a stable base of power. And so this is why you see this idea of body positivity being extremely important. And again, that's a direct quote from the person in charge of the character development and content for Marvel. They have to do this. They have to turn the old beautiful Carol Danvers or the old beautiful She-Hulk into these ugly lumps that look nothing like a woman, because of course they have to beat this out of the reader for Marvel Comics. They have to beat the notion out of them that no. See, that was the old way to think about women. That's the old way to empower women. And we've moved on since then. Therefore, if you ask for beautiful women in any of your comics, you're trying to move us backwards. And therefore, we can't have that. Even to the extent that they can no longer have these stories, even if they are stories that are based upon this new feminism and this new feminist idea, and still have the women be beautiful. No, they can't have that, because in their minds, that would be moving backwards and saying that their source of power comes from the physical. But they've moved on from this, and that's why body positivity is so important to them right now. And that's why in a visual medium, you get nothing but ugly-looking women and ugly-looking characters. Because you're supposed to identify with the women as being powerful because they're saintly and good at science, not because they're beautiful. That would be trying to regress feminism into the idea that power comes from the physical. But to move on even from that, there is another form of this feminist control that has been taking root, at the very least, since the late 1990s. And it is something that used to be called women's theory and is now talked about as women's studies. Now, this is something that a lot of people who don't care about feminist studies because it's a lot of nonsense don't actually understand. And I would say maybe you're saner for that. But the idea is that there is a female form of science. And these ideas, by the way, they're not fringe ideas within feminism. They go straight back to, at the very least, the late 1960s and are expressed in their literature and are fixed to the core of feminism itself. So again, the idea is that there is a female form of science, and it is opposed to the male form of science. And the female form of science is based upon subjectivity. That is to say, as opposed to the male objectivity. Objectivity, by the way, where we get things like reason and logic and science as we actually understand it. And just to give you a couple of examples of the way that this female science works and how it is developed, I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from female studies or women's studies journals and books that go back all the way to the 1990s that talk about this exact thing. The first one that I compiled says the following. They're talking about the priority of women's studies, and they're saying the priority of women's studies is to train students not only to master a body of knowledge, but also to serve as symbolic, quote, viruses that infect, unsettle, and disrupt traditional and entrenched fields. In so doing, we frame two new properties for women's studies. One, training male students as viruses, and two, embracing, quote, negative stereotypes of feminist professors as important future directions for the potentially liberatory aspects of the field. And that was from a journal called the Multidisciplinary Journal of Gender Studies. Another quote about the female sciences goes like this. The inclusion of personal concern into the research process is an indispensable element of feminist science. The same holds for the principle of partiality. And that's from a book called Feminist Sociology from 1997. And it's basically saying that the feminist scientist and researcher must personally insert themselves into what they are studying. Not be objective in any way, but personally insert themselves into it. Another quote from the Handbook of Qualitative Research in Psychology goes like this. Feminist studies, which are named either feminist research, women's research, or since the 1990s, gender studies, their emergence and development cannot be separated from the political movements at their respective times. So here we have an admission, straight up admission, that these female sciences, so-called, cannot in any way be separated from the political that gave them birth to begin with. And I'll give you just two more about feminist science. One from the Feminist Theory and Practice says, if women make their own subjective concern as the starting point and guideline for their research, then they are first sensitized. And this is exactly what, quote, feminist science is supposed to be about. You need to inject yourself subjectively into even the starting point of what you are going to study. They even go so far as to put this down in a methodological process. In a book called Feminist Theory and Practice, they have a list of methodological postulates. And they say the following: the postulate of value freedom, neutrality, and indifference towards research objects, which has been the most important yardstick for objectivity so far, is now being replaced by conscious partiality. And they go on to say, the contemplative, uninvolved audience research is replaced by active participation in emancipatory actions and the integration of research into these actions. So why am I talking about all of this? Well, I'm talking about all this because what you hear in these quotes, this has already taken over the humanities. This feminist science has already taken hold. They separate it into what they call quantitative science, which is the male, as opposed to qualitative science, which is the female. Quantitative being the fact that you use things like math to determine how you're going to do an experiment, whereas the qualitative, the female way of doing an experiment, is through empathy, is through inserting yourself into the project. And it always has to be remembered, these things and their study groups cannot, as stated, be separated from the political that gave birth to them. So this is a fancy way of saying that the political ideology of progressivism needs to be inserted into what they call science, and science needs to be turned into something subjective, which is dependent upon their political ideology, as opposed to your objective science, your objective reason, your objective logic, which is all oppressive. And here is where we get into what we see around us in the stories, especially at Marvel Comics. You see a push for women in STEM. Now, some of these disturbing images that I'm showing you in the background, these feminist images, show Riri Williams, and I think it's the IRONMAN covers from 2016, 2017. And you have right on the cover, women in STEM, because they had at the back of the book these stories about women who work in hard sciences. And this continued on into other books like Wasp and Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. They continued on even up until the last couple of months. They have still been doing this, pushing this idea of women in STEM, women in the hard sciences. And you have these stories constantly where you have these women who are supposedly great at science and they're always doing the science, but there's no actual science behind it. And you wonder why there's no actual science behind it. If they're actually trying to promote science, wouldn't they actually know something about science? Well, no, it's because it's female science. It's not the actual science that you and I would think about, not the objective, rational, logical science. No, it's the subjective science, where the female insert themselves in an empathetic way into what they are studying and bring the political into what they are actually going to produce as their ends. And by the way, there is a directed reason why they wish to do that. The directed reason, of course, is the fact that they wish to get more and more women into the hard sciences, because the hard sciences, the STEM fields, are the last holdouts in the university settings for actually being objective. And they're starting to crumble. Because, of course, as that first quote that I gave you says, they want these ideas that they are producing to act as viruses. They want women and men to carry these viruses into other fields and, as it says, unsettle, infect, and disrupt traditional and entrenched fields. And these entrenched fields, the last holdout for these entrenched fields, are the hard sciences. So again, the purpose behind pushing this so much within these stories is to get more and more women into these hard sciences so that they can be a Trojan horse to bring what they call female science into the hard sciences so they too can be corrupted with this idea that is based upon nothing more than political ideology. And here's where we get into the point of what I really want to talk about. Because what you see in these characters and in these stories is the new progressive idea of a hero, especially the new progressive feminist idea of a hero. This is the destruction of everything that an actual hero is. Of course, the actual hero that has gone through Western civilization for, as I always say, at least 3,000 years, has been for, at the very minimum, 2,500 years, based upon an objective ideal. And that objective ideal is the fact that you need to have right reason. And right reason is reason in accord with reality, objective reality. And when you have that, that is the only way that you can first build those virtues that make you a paragon of virtue, which then allow you to become a hero. But of course, objectivity must be gotten rid of. You need to move everything into the female science way of looking at things, which is subjectivity. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why continuity must not only be discarded, but be eliminated completely. Because, of course, continuity would say that there is an objective standard to what you're actually reading. There is a standard history. There is a standard character development. There is a standard set of powers for this individual. All of that is saying that there is an objective standard. And of course, you have to get rid of objective standards altogether. And that is another reason why you're reading these stories where continuity doesn't mean a thing. And by the way, I would say this also plays into why they constantly reboot everything and don't care what came before. This is even why we have the financial structure of how these comic companies work right now. And they constantly reboot things thinking that this is going to be better and it doesn't matter what came before, because continuity doesn't matter. Actually, continuity needs to be destroyed. But besides all of that, the question then arises, what do we do about all of this? How can we root this out? How can we get back to simply good storytelling? How can we get back to the masculine and the idea that the masculine is a good thing? Well, a lot of people turn to things like the men's movement, but the funny thing is that even though the feminists fight against things like the men's movement, they actually like it to some degree, because it's based upon the model of the feminist movement itself. And so the men's movement, to some degree, is actually playing according to the rules of feminism, which means ultimately they're simply going to fail. And besides that, I don't think we need any kind of movement to push back against this nonsense, because that's exactly what it is. It is nonsense, as I talked about at the first. It is a declaration of war against reality itself. And so for things like law, we need to move back to the idea that, well, no, equality has a definition, and we need to follow that definition. For things like science, we need to understand that it is based upon objectivity. If you're not using objectivity, you're not doing anything even close to science, and you need to leave. And for the realm of story, we need to move back to the traditional idea of a hero. Because, well, first of all, I would say that for the young, this is something that needs to be there. For them to understand their existence, whether they be male or female. This idea of virtue, and how you use virtue as an expression of the power that is granted to you, and how that will not only interact correctly with reality, but will make you into someone who is pursuing their own excellence. And I don't know about you, but that's how I know that I'm reading a good story. When I finish that story and I get to the end and I feel like because of this story, because of this thing that I have just read, because of this hero that I have just seen, I want to be a better person, this is the reason for stories to begin with. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right. I'll see you later. Bye.